There's a strange moment that almost no one talks about. You don't fight your old habits anymore. You don't resist them. You don't even try to change. And yet, something unsettling starts to happen. The patterns that once defined you simply stop holding. Not because you became stronger, but because something inside you no longer participates in them. And if you don't understand what's happening here, you might think you're losing yourself, when in reality, something much deeper is taking its place. In the Sophia Stage, change doesn't look like discipline. It doesn't look like effort. It looks like disappearance. Your habits don't break anymore. They lose the structure that once kept them alive. And when that happens, what feels like confusion on the surface is actually a deeper reorganization taking place underneath. It doesn't announce itself clearly. There's no moment where you decide to change. No clear break between who you were and who you're becoming. It begins in small, almost forgettable situations. A message arrives, and you don't feel the same urgency to respond. Someone misunderstands you, and the need to explain yourself doesn't rise the way it used to. A familiar tension appears, but instead of reacting automatically, something in you stays still. It isn't forced stillness. It isn't control. It feels more like absence. And what makes it even harder to recognize is how ordinary these moments seem. Nothing dramatic is happening. The conversation continues. The situation unfolds as it always has. From the outside, nothing appears different. But internally, something small has shifted. A reaction that would normally complete itself simply doesn't. And because it doesn't create tension, it doesn't call attention to itself either. It passes quietly, almost unnoticed. And that's why this change is so easy to overlook in the beginning. You might tell yourself you're just tired, less reactive than usual, maybe just a little more distant. But then it happens again and again. The same situations that used to pull you in no longer have the same grip. And what makes this even more confusing is that you didn't actively change anything. You didn't build a new habit. You didn't replace one behavior with another. You didn't create a system to control yourself. Something simply stopped engaging. And that's a very different kind of change. Because most of what we call growth is built on effort. You notice a pattern. You fight it. You try to override it with something better. But here, there is no fight. The pattern doesn't get stronger. It doesn't resist. It just stops being sustained. And that's where a subtle doubt begins to appear. Because if you're not the one actively changing your behavior, then what exactly is? To understand this, you have to look beneath the habit itself. What we usually call a habit is only the visible part of something deeper. It's not just what you do. It's what gets activated inside you before the action even happens. Think about how certain reactions don't feel like decisions. Someone says something in a certain tone, and before you even process it, something tightens inside you. You feel the urge to explain yourself, to defend, to withdraw, to prove something, and it all happens so quickly. It almost feels like it wasn't a choice. That's the level where these patterns actually live. Carl Jung called these structures complexes, but instead of thinking of them as something abstract, it's easier to see them as emotional imprints that learned how to organize your reactions over time. At some point, an experience repeated itself enough times, and your mind found a way to respond to it efficiently. It doesn't happen consciously. It happens automatically. So the next time something similar happens, you don't start from zero. You enter the pattern. Sometimes, it begins with something small. A look, a tone of voice, a short message that feels slightly off, a trigger And almost instantly, something inside you starts moving. Before you can think clearly, before you can choose, the reaction is already forming. You might begin to notice this in very different parts of your life. At work, a situation that would normally trigger a quick response no longer unfolds the same way. Someone challenges your idea in a meeting, and instead of immediately defending it, you notice the impulse forming, and then softening before it fully takes over. At home, a familiar dynamic appears. A comment that would usually pull you into explanation or tension. But this time, the reaction doesn't complete itself. You hear it. You understand it. But something in you no longer moves automatically to respond. Even in small decisions, the change becomes visible. You reach for something you would normally do without thinking, and pause. Not to control yourself, not to choose something better, but because the automatic movement simply isn't as strong as it used to be. And the more this repeats, the more natural it feels, until eventually, it stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like you. That's why these patterns are so persistent, because you're not just dealing with a behavior. You're dealing with something that has been quietly shaping how you interpret situations, how you feel about them, and how you respond. And that's also why trying to break a habit often feels exhausting. Because on the surface, you're trying to change what you do. But underneath, the structure generating that behavior is still active, still organizing, still pulling. So even if you manage to control the action, the impulse remains, waiting for a moment where your attention slips. What's different in the Sophia stage is not that you become better at controlling the habit. It's that the structure itself begins to lose strength. The trigger happens, but something doesn't fully activate. The situation is there, but it doesn't take hold in the same way. It's as if the pattern starts to disconnect from you. And when that happens, the habit doesn't need to be resisted, because the force behind it is no longer fully there. And that's where the experience becomes difficult to explain. Because when a pattern weakens at this level, it doesn't just change what you do. It begins to change what feels like you. And when something begins to change at that level, you don't experience it as a clear transformation. You experience it as absence. There are moments where you pause, not because you're choosing differently, but because nothing in you moves in the old direction anymore. The situation is familiar. The context is the same, but the internal pull is gone. And that's where things start to feel disorienting. Because for a long time, those inner movements were not just reactions. They were part of how you recognized yourself. The need to explain, the need to maintain a certain image, the need to resolve tension quickly or avoid it altogether. Those impulses gave you a kind of continuity, a sense that you knew how you would respond, a sense that you knew who you were in those moments. So when they stop appearing, you don't immediately feel free. You feel undefined. There's a gap between what used to happen automatically and what is now simply not there. You may notice it in moments where nothing seems to be happening. You're sitting in a conversation, and instead of preparing what to say next, your mind remains quiet for longer than usual, or you find yourself alone, in a situation that would normally pull your attention outward, checking something, reacting to something, filling the space, and instead, there is no urgency to do anything at all. At first, this can feel unfamiliar, almost like something is missing. But if you stay with it, you begin to notice that this absence is not empty. It's simply not filled with the same automatic movements as before. And in that gap, something unfamiliar emerges. Not a new identity, not a new pattern, just space. There can be moments where you almost look for the old reaction, not because you want it back, but because you expect it to be there. A familiar situation unfolds, and part of you anticipates the usual response, but it doesn't arrive, and for a brief second, there's a quiet disorientation. It feels like reaching for something that has always been there, and realizing it no longer answers in the same way. And that space can feel uncomfortable in a very specific way. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, but quiet and unstructured. Because most people are used to being guided by something internal. An impulse, a preference, a reaction that gives direction to the moment. But now, that direction is weaker. And without it, you're left with a question that doesn't resolve itself quickly. If this no longer defines how I respond, then what does? And this is where the experience is often misunderstood. Because from the outside, nothing seems wrong. But internally, something familiar is no longer there to organize you. And without that structure, it can feel like you've lost something important. When in reality, what's fading is not your sense of self, but the patterns that once held it together. As soon as those patterns begin to loosen, something else has the space to emerge. Not as a reaction, not as a habit, not as something you perform, but as something that was always there, just not at the center. Carl Jung described this as the difference between the personality you build and the deeper self that exists beneath it. Most of what we call who we are is shaped through adaptation. You learn how to respond, how to be perceived, how to maintain connection, avoid conflict, preserve a certain image. And over time, those adaptations become so consistent that they start to feel like your identity. But they are not the center. They are structures built around it, like something shaped at the surface, while a much larger part remains unseen below. And as long as those structures remain active, they organize your experience from the outside in. They tell you how to react, how to feel, how to interpret what's happening. But when they begin to dissolve, that organizing force weakens, and for the first time, your experience is no longer being shaped in the same automatic way. That's why things feel unfamiliar, not because you are losing yourself, but because you are no longer being directed by what was never your center to begin with. And this is where the shift becomes difficult to explain, because the self doesn't appear the way a new identity does. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't replace the old patterns with something equally defined. It is quieter than that, more stable, but less visible. You don't feel it as something you are doing. You notice it in what no longer needs to happen, in the reactions that don't fully form, in the impulses that don't take over, in the growing sense that you are no longer being pulled in directions that once felt inevitable. You may begin to recognize this in very simple ways. In a conversation where you no longer feel the need to position yourself in a certain way, in a moment where you could react, but instead, you simply observe, without effort, without resistance, or in decisions that feel quieter, less driven by urgency, less influenced by how they will be perceived. There is no strong internal voice pushing you forward, and yet, there is also no confusion, just a different kind of clarity. One that doesn't need to explain itself. You may notice this in very ordinary moments. Someone around you becomes more reactive than expected, and instead of being pulled into their emotional pace, you remain where you are. A decision that once would have taken hours of internal debate now feels strangely simple, not because the decision is easier, but because less of you is being divided against itself. Or you find yourself in a room, in a conversation, in a familiar social dynamic, and for the first time, you are not quietly adjusting your inner position, just to maintain comfort around you. You are present. You understand what is happening, but you are no longer reshaping yourself. to keep the moment psychologically smooth for everyone else. And that difference is subtle from the outside. Yet internally, it changes everything. That can feel like uncertainty, because there is less structure guiding you. But it is also a different kind of stability, not built on repetition, but on something that does not need to repeat itself to exist. And this is the part most people try to rush past, because it doesn't give you immediate clarity. It doesn't tell you who to become next. It simply removes what no longer holds, and leaves you closer to something that doesn't depend on those patterns to define you. But this shift doesn't happen in isolation. Even as something in you begins to reorganize, the world around you continues to respond to who you used to be. People still expect the same reactions, the same availability, the same emotional patterns, the same way of engaging that once felt natural to you. And in many situations, it would be easier to return to that, to respond the way you always did, to say what is expected, to step back into a version of yourself that still fits the moment, not because it's true anymore, but because it's familiar. And familiarity has a kind of gravity. It pulls you back into patterns that no longer fully belong to you, but still know how to function. You might notice it when you begin to move in a different direction, a decision that doesn't fully make sense to others, a change in how you want to live, or work, or use your time. And almost immediately, the questions come. Are you sure? Why would you do that now? Does this even make sense? And there's a moment where you would normally explain. You would organize your reasons, make them sound coherent, show that you've thought everything through, so it feels valid, so it feels acceptable. But this time, something shifts. The need to justify yourself doesn't fully rise. You can still respond, but it no longer comes from that same pressure to be understood. Sometimes, the pressure doesn't come directly through questions. It comes through subtle reactions, a pause after you answer, a look that suggests something is missing, a slight shift in tone that implies your response wasn't enough. And without anyone saying it clearly, you can feel the expectation to explain more, to justify, to return to the version of yourself that made things easier for others to understand. And for a brief moment, you feel the pull to go back, to make yourself easier to read, to soften the tension, to step back into a version of yourself that fits more easily into what others expect. But it doesn't fully take hold. And even if there's uncertainty, you don't step back into the pattern completely, because something in you has already seen through it. It's not a clear decision, but a quiet recognition that returning to what is familiar would no longer feel the same. And that's the tension of this stage. It's no longer about right or wrong, but about the subtle difference between what still works and what no longer feels true. If you're not attentive here, it becomes easy to rebuild the pattern, not because it's strong, but because it offers structure, because it gives you something to stand on again. But if you remain in that pause, without rushing to resolve it, something deeper begins to stabilize on its own. It doesn't come as a habit, or as a clearly defined role. It shows itself in a quieter way, as a way of being that no longer depends on repeating what you've already outgrown. And over time, something else becomes noticeable. The absence that once felt uncertain no longer feels unstable. You begin to trust it, not because you understand it completely, but because it no longer feels like something is missing. It feels like something unnecessary is no longer there. And that realization doesn't arrive as a conclusion. It arrives slowly, through repeated moments that begin to feel different. A situation that would once stay in your mind for hours simply passes. A reaction that used to define your mood no longer shapes the rest of your day. An interaction that once required emotional effort resolves itself without leaving anything behind. And at first, these changes seem almost too small to matter, too quiet to be called transformation. But over time, they begin to accumulate. And what you start to notice is not just that certain patterns are gone, but that your entire relationship with experience has shifted. You are no longer moving through life, trying to manage reactions. You are no longer organizing yourself around what needs to be maintained. And without that constant effort, something becomes lighter, not because everything is resolved, but because less of you is being pulled into what no longer needs to continue. So what's happening here is not a loss of control, and it's not a lack of direction. It's something much more precise. The patterns that once organized your experience are no longer doing that in the same way. And without them, you are not immediately replaced by something new. You are left, for a while, without the usual structure that told you who you were in each moment. And that can feel unfamiliar, because most people don't realize how much of their identity is built on repetition, on reactions that happen often enough to feel like something stable. But when those reactions begin to fade, what remains is not emptiness. It's a different kind of presence, one that doesn't need to assert itself, one that doesn't need to repeat in order to exist. And that's why this stage can't be rushed. Because if you try to define yourself too quickly, you return to the same mechanism that kept those patterns alive. But if you allow this space to remain, even without clarity, even without a clear sense of direction, something more stable begins to take shape. Not as a role, not as a fixed identity, but as a way of being that is no longer organized around what you learn to be. And this is where the shift becomes real. Not when you replace your habits, not when you define who you are, but when you no longer depend on repeating what you've already outgrown in order to feel like yourself. And when you stop depending on those patterns, something else begins to take shape, quietly, without needing to be defined. And for many people, this shift begins at a very specific moment, the moment when the need for approval starts to disappear. If you've felt that happening, there's a deeper layer to it that most people don't fully understand. You'll find it in this next video, where we explore what begins to change when approval is no longer what moves you,